In 2014, my grandma was diagnosed with a deadly disease and was hospitalized for a couple of months. Being in and out of the hospital, I grew comfortable and used to being there. My siblings and parents worked night shift. I was the only one that went to college, so I had to watch over my grandma at night. With that being said, I was the one who spent most nights with her. One night while she was sleeping, she kept mumbling words like, "No, I'm not ready. I'm not ready to go with you. You can go ahead." She continued to mumble words and grunt weird noises. I was a young skeptical college student, so I budged to wake her up and didn't think much of her sleep talk. She would go back to sleep to have the sleep talks again. This happened once or twice the night. I was on my laptop one night and was surprised to hear the TV's volume go up on full blast. I immediately looked at my grandma, and she had the remote in her hands. I kept telling her to lower the volume because it was late at night, but she ignored me. I went up to her and asked her to lower the volume again. She finally listened and gave the remote to me. My grandma told me she turned the TV on because there was someone right by her that kept talking to her. My grandma said it was a lady in a beautiful dress. The lady was telling my grandma to go with her to a place far away. The lady promised to show my grandma her birthplace and her old villages back in Laos and Thailand. Of course, my grandma rejected her, but the lady wouldn't stop bothering my grandma. She could hear the lady every time she closed her eyes. Like I said, I wasn't a big believer in ghosts, although I come from a very religious family. I told my grandma to go back to sleep because she was probably dreaming. I told her I would sleep by her side while turning the TV off. She nodded her head and called my mom about the whole thing, and my mom told her she would come by the morning when she was off from work. The next day, my mom came to replace me because I had classes at 1 p.m. When I came to replace my mom, Grandma was already asleep in bed, so my mom told me to give her her meds when she woke up. Later that night, I gave my grandma her meds and she knocked out around 2 in the morning. I was on my laptop doing my class discussions when my grandma shouted at me to check the bathroom. It caught me by surprise again, and now this time, I was creeped out because it was the second time Grandma did this. I turned to the bathroom and I swore the door was creaking, like someone was just there looking at us. But it hid back inside when I turned to the door. Now in my head, I started thinking of all the ghost stories my parents and cousins tell me, and it creeped me out even more. My grandma was telling me to tell the lady in the restroom to stop with the tongue flickering because it was bothering her, and she can't stand the noises that were coming out from the lady's mouth. I turned on the light and went to close the door without checking the restroom because I wasn't planning to see a ghost that night. I called my boyfriend and forced him to stay up with me on the phone that night. I told my parents about my grandma, and they told me to keep it quiet until she gets out of the hospital. Apparently, my mother saw the same thing I did. When my grandma was finally discharged, she said the lady in the beautiful dress was one of her ancestors and wanted to take her with them, so she could cook and clean for her ancestors. My grandma refused, and that was what triggered them. They even told my grandma that they'll stay in the hospital with her in case she dies. I freaked out thinking about the ghost staying in the same room, just staring at me while I worked on my laptop. I asked my mom what she saw while she was at the hospital with my grandma. She told me she experienced many strange things, but this one night totally scared her so much that she left the room to get a nurse to check on my grandma, as an excuse to get someone else to be in the same room with them. My mom said she was asleep next to my grandma when my grandma woke up and started hitting my mom in the face. My mom woke up and my grandma started telling my mom to go away. My grandma was calling my mom the name of an aunt that passed away 2 years ago. My dead aunt was called Chi. Grandma was yelling at my dead Aunt Chi to leave or she would cut her in half, while slapping my mom. My mom slapped her back and it made her stop. She said when my grandma stopped, she could hear giggles in the restroom. My mom immediately got up and went to look for a nurse. My grandma was fine after leaving the hospital and didn't see anything. She peacefully passed away last year. I dragged myself out of bed and managed to throw on my scrubs and make myself look human. I recently started a new job at the hospital and had no seniority, so I had the overnight shift. Aside from the messed up sleep cycle, it wasn't too bad, although the weekends nights were a lot quieter and creepier. I drove into work and started my rounds. The hallways were pretty much empty. I stopped by each assigned room and peeked in. All was as it should be. I headed back toward the nurse's station, and as I did, I heard what sounded like a low moan. I stopped dead in my tracks. Did I really hear something, or is my mind playing tricks on me? It was so quiet I swore I could hear my heartbeat. I shook it off and kept walking. Then I heard it again, this time louder. It was unmistakable. It was coming from the room a few doors down. I just literally checked, so I knew everyone was sleeping. It would be wrong if I just took off running in the opposite direction, so I did what I had to. I turned around and walked back to room 12. I knocked lightly on the door and slowly peeked in. I stepped in slowly and inched closer to the patient. The room was dark and I could barely see. I suddenly heard a low sobbing. It was the patient in the room, complaining that his back hurts. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was not uncommon to hear patients moan in pain. After a round of medication, the patient settled down, and I went on with my tasks. I had to restock the supply room and hated doing so, partly because I had to go all the way down the hall and around the corner to grab what I needed. No use getting out of it, so I grabbed my list and headed down the hall. I rounded the corner and rushed into the room to grab my stuff. I ran out of there quickly and started to head back towards safety. Right before I rounded the corner leading to my station, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the opposite direction. Was I being silly again and letting my mind trick me into being a fool? I turned around, and down the hall was an older lady walking around in her hospital gown. I parked my supply cart to the side and started walking towards the lady. Sometimes we have patients get up in the middle of the night and wonder. Although it was my co-worker's section, I figured he was busy doing other things, so I'll help this lady get back to bed. She looked confused, pacing back and forth like she was waiting for someone. I greeted her hello as loud, yet as quiet as I could. She stopped and turned around to look at me. It was a little old Hmong lady. She looked so frail and weak I wondered how she even got herself out of bed. I knew she didn't speak English, and I didn't want to confuse her any more than she already was. So I spoke in Hmong, asking if she needed help. She started to walk up to me. She looked around and said that she was cold. She must have been freezing and woke up to find help. She started to shake, and I saw what looked like fear in her eyes. She searched her surroundings with frantic eyes and responded. Earlier today I was upstairs in my room, and it was warm. Then later they moved me downstairs, so now I can't sleep because it's too cold. I knew exactly what was happening. She must have been a transfer from the unit upstairs. I always thought the higher floors were warmer. It gets colder as you head down the floors. I'll take you to your room and get you an extra blanket. I reached out to place a hand on her back as if to encourage her to lead me to her room. She was ice cold. Her back was exposed, and she looked as pale as the walls. Let's go to your room, and I'll help get you warmed up. She started to breathe really fast. I won't go back to that room. It's smaller, and it's too cold, she said. Please don't put me back in that small cold room. It feels like a freezer, and I'm scared. At this point I thought about paging the nurse, but decided not to because it would upset the patient more. I tried to convince her to lead me back to her room. I guess I could have ran back to the desk to find out who she was and where her room was, but I didn't want her to wander off. Can you take me back upstairs to my old room? They moved me, and my family doesn't know where to find me. They'll be coming to see me, and I won't be there. I couldn't just take her to a different unit. She was here for a reason, so I lied. We already contacted your family. They know where your new room is. They know it gets cold, and they've asked me to help you. They've asked me to get you an extra blanket to keep you warm for the night. This little lady was making this harder than it should be, but it was nothing I wasn't used to. I knew the only way to get this lady back in bed was to prove to her that I'd fix her problem. If you agree to go back to your room, I'll go get you a warm blanket, and I'll be sure your family knows where your room is when they come. She looked at me and smiled softly. As long as they know, and as long as I'm not cold. I convinced her to cooperate. I told her to wait there, and I'd be right back with a blanket. I ran down the hall, grabbed my cart, and headed back to the station. I grabbed a heated blanket and started to head back down the hall, when my co-worker Larry popped out from one of the rooms. He asked me where I went because I was gone for a while. One of your patients is out of bed, and she's cold. I was just going to run down there with a blanket and help her back to her room, I said. He looked at me and asked what lady. Of course, I didn't know what room. She must be a transfer because I haven't seen her around. He had this confused look on his face. He took out his assignment sheet and skimmed through it. I don't have any Hmong people on my sheet. I told him I was pretty darn sure she was Hmong. He thought and even checked his sheet one more time. Nope, no Hmong lady. No Hmong patients at all. He showed me his sheet. I took mine out too and looked it over. None for me as well. I peered down the long hallway to the opposite end and saw that she was no longer there. We both ran down and peeked around the corner. The only Hmong patient we've had was this little lady, but she was only here for 2 days. She passed away on the first shift, and they took her down to the morgue, Larry explained. I had goosebumps all over. I could feel the hairs on my head stand up. My heart was racing so fast I thought I'd keel over and pass out. Larry asked me if I was good because my face looked different, like I had seen something. In my mind, I'm thinking that perhaps I did. However, my sanity was at stake here, so I played it off. I think I am all right. Maybe I'm thinking of another night. Lack of sleep. You know how it goes. He laughed, and I forced a chuckle. You probably shouldn't be at work. Sleep deprivation will have you see things. I completed the rest of my shift, and by the time the morning shift came in, I was glad to be done. I didn't even remember the drive home. I didn't remember driving or even getting out of my car and into my bed. That morning I had a dream that still haunts me to this day. I dreamed of that little old Hmong lady. She came to me dressed in her Hmong funeral attire. Her flesh wasn't rotting or anything gruesome like that. If not for the funeral attire and the bluish tint, she'd look lively. In my dream, she stood next to my bed and shook me awake. I opened my eyes, and she had a grin on her face. An unusual grin that seems to spread from ear to ear. She doubled in size from the layers of attire she wore. I tried to scream, but I was paralyzed. I just felt like I was being held in place against my will. You never brought me a blanket. I was cold. I was very cold all night in that freezer. I wanted to yell I'm sorry and tell her that I tried giving her a blanket, but she was gone. I wanted to beg for forgiveness, wanted to cry, but no matter how hard I tried, I could not make a single sound. She pointed to her shirt and asked me if I liked her new clothes. My family brought me some shirts and pants so I won't be cold anymore. She squealed and started to laugh. She started to lean in closer to my face, and I smelled the rotting flesh. It smelled like raw moldy meat. The closer she leaned in, the more pressure I felt on my chest. I couldn't scream or move, but I did try. I started to cry and prayed in my head. I prayed I would wake up from this nightmare. She kept getting closer and closer, and that smell got stronger and stronger. I couldn't move my body at all, but I managed to shut my eyes. Inside, I was screaming so loud I would have woken the dead if the sound managed to escape my lungs. It felt like an eternity, and I felt myself running out of breath. But I finally felt the weight lifted, and I woke up to the afternoon sun breaking in through the cracks in the blinds. I was covered in sweat, and my chest was sore. It felt like a sumo wrestler had sat on me. I called in sick later that evening and spent the next day recovering from my ordeal. A week went by without incident. I seemed to have forgotten about the unsettling events that had occurred the previous week. I woke up the following Sunday afternoon, and came upstairs to find my little brother sprawled out on the couch. "Where's Mom and Dad?" I asked. Without ever looking up from his cartoon, he replied, "Funeral." I asked him whose funeral did they go to. Again, without straying from the TV screen, he replied, "Some random old Hmong lady." I don't know why, but all those feelings came back. The paralyzing fear, the millions of racing thoughts. I found out later from my parents it was an older lady who died at the very hospital I worked at just the week before. I never did tell them about what happened. I never bothered to find out if it was the same lady that haunted me. I like to believe it's coincidence, but you know what they say, seeing is believing.